My name is David Messias, and I'd like to welcome you all to the Veritas Forum at the University of Florida. The Veritas Forum is something that is not a debate. So we're going to enjoy each other tonight, and bear with me over the next 5 minutes as I share some administration. So we're not here to see anyone win, lose, or score points after each other. Tonight's event is about truth, and that's the definition of Veritas. So we're here for a real discussion, connecting truth to our hardest questions and deepest beliefs. We have asked our presenters to share personally. So what does that mean? It means that they're not going to represent their institutions. We're going to create a safe environment for us to discuss some intellectual truth and vigor. Why are we having this conversation? We see around us the presidential election that's close. We see standoffs over federal land. We see protests in the aftermath of police-involved shootings. We see migrations of huge numbers of people. What is gained from spending time talking and thinking? What is at stake in our current moment? Laura, why don't we start with you?
Okay.
When you think of why have this conversation, why is it relevant today with all of the circumstances? Why does it matter that we talk about it?
It's a very big question. As the dean of a law school, I would say my mission is to help my students and the entire community at UF Law understand the various approaches to justice and to think about how to apply them to the most pressing problems of our time. And I think right now there's a real deficit in how we are engaging across differences, particularly in the political sphere. We've come to a point of extreme binary thinking, us versus them, yes or no, for or against, instead of having spaces like this one to really grapple with how we could think about the problems facing our society in a way that doesn't just bring people together. I'm not talking about a kumbaya moment here, but instead gets us to think about the nuances and to see that even if we might be attracted to simple solutions, to binary thinking, that sort of thinking, that sort of engagement might be good sound bites, but will never help us actually achieve justice.
Laura, I think you raised a very interesting thought, right? And so let me try and use my own words to say what you just said. In the political arena right now, can we all agree that it's really hard for politicians to say things that aren't guarded or polished or really thought about? I think what this university setting really opens up and offers us is an opportunity to be a little more vulnerable, a little more personal, a little more honest, without having the repercussions of not being elected. So, David, with that in mind, with thinking about justice, why have this conversation?
Well, I agree with everything that Laura said about the importance of nuance and of multiple perspectives and of really not cloistering ourselves with people that think the way that we think. And so I think that's one reason this kind of conversation is very important. I think conversations at universities in general have the benefit of being able to stumble as we think through these things. and to being able to think through things with a long-term perspective, not needing to take immediate action, but really thinking about what this means for us, what it may mean for us over time. And for all of those reasons, I think the university is a unique location. It also is the case that many of these controversies have exploded on universities. So more than in the past, the controversy, or more than for the past generation, the controversies have been on universities, and they have often reflected, in my view, an inability to speak across differences. And so, in a sense, what we're trying to do tonight, I think, is a little bit of a reset. You know, can we start talking about some of these things, at least in a small way, over again, and listen to each other a little bit more?
So let's stick with that for a little bit, but let me change it up just a tad. So this is a conversation about justice between two people who have considerable experience with the law, but also come to the conversation with particular different views. So let's start off with David. How do you define justice?
So Laura said the last question was a big question. This is a very, very big question, and I wrestle through how I define justice. But since you asked me a big question, I'm going to give you a big answer and not try to unpack it all at once. As I think through justice and what justice is and what justice means, it seems to me, and I'm bringing a particular perspective to bear on this. I'm bringing an explicitly Christian perspective to bear on it. It seems to me that the heart of justice is an attempt to reconcile and to balance freedom and equality. That the two key principles that we think about and work with when we wrestle with issues of justice are freedom and equality. And when we promote freedom, often we have to do that to a small extent at the expense of equality and vice versa. And so I think working through justice issues is working through how do you balance those two objectives. And in my view, true justice will play itself out as relationship. If you have balanced freedom and equality effectively, you will have real, meaningful relationships at every strata of a society. So that is a very big kind of law professor answer to a very big question.
Thank you, David. Laura, how do you define justice?
Well, David's answer was fascinating because I would too root justice in relationships. Maybe I would say a connection between individuals. But I also want to admit that the question of defining justice is one that either I'm not as interested in as I should be, or I have grappled with it so much that I've put it aside. So you know, the verse in the Bible that affects my thinking every day is Micah 6:8. You know, what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, to love mercy, to walk humbly with your God. And I focus so much on the second two, to show mercy and to act humbly, walk humbly, and I often wonder if I do that because I think mercy and humility are core aspects of justice, and a relationship-based conception of justice might feed into that, or if I just want to avoid the question of what is justice and instead almost excise that part of the verse and instead focus on mercy and humility, which I would say means giving each other the benefit of the doubt as we grapple with the most pressing problems of our time.
So, Laura, you referenced a chapter in the Bible, a book of the Bible, and it seems like you have allowed that to be a guiding force in your life. How has how has justice impacted your either relationship or perception or connection with God?
I'm going to resist some of these questions. I grew up with religion being the guiding principle of my life. It structured every aspect of my life until I was 17. I grew up in an Anabaptist faith, the Church of the Brethren, that deeply believed in simple living. And interestingly, not resorting to the courts. So I grew up with a conception of justice that was completely divorced from law and a huge skepticism of law. And it was part of my, my parents would say rebellion. I would say my intellectual growth, that I began to view different conceptions of justice, including legal conceptions of justice, ultimately going to law school. In doing so, I would say that I no longer think of myself as having a daily relationship with God. Certainly I did when I was younger, and because I have changed my approach to faith, I don't view it so much as a daily relationship, but I do view it as continuing to shape my instincts, how I approach questions, and more importantly, how I approach others. I do my best to act generously in my interactions with others, but also toward myself. And I think my early relationship with God and the church influenced that greatly.
David, when you think about the question, how does justice, or the awareness of it, how did it impact your relationship, connection with God?
So my trajectory was in many respects exactly the opposite of Laura's. And interestingly, I think we've ended up in some similar places on many issues. I did not grow up in a religious household. I did not grow up with religion of any sort as a strong presence in my life. I embraced Christianity when I was in college, and the way I embraced Christianity was kind of backhanded and accidental. I was an English major in college, and we read lots of books that had Christian references in them, and since I had never been to Sunday school as a kid, I never recognized what the Christian references were. And I reached the point one day, and I remember what that point was. The point was the class I was taking, we were reading a very well-known short story called The Ram in the Thicket. The Ram in the Thicket is a short story. The references to the Abraham and Isaac story in Genesis, and God providing a substitute sacrifice, a ram, when Abraham thought he was going to be sacrificing Isaac. I had no idea what that story was about and what those references were. And so I concluded that even if the Bible was a bunch of crock, I needed to at least read it to see what was in it. And I started reading it after my sophomore year in college during a trip out west, when I was going out west to find myself with a couple of friends. And I got, within the first few chapters of Genesis, the Bible was for me, unlike anything I had ever read. It was real in a way that the other things I was reading was not real. And I was persuaded that it was true and is true. And so the worldview that I hold now, I developed relatively late in college. How I would have thought about justice then, I would have thought about, well, first of all, I would have thought about it as, and did think about it, as not really connected with my worldview. And I would have thought about justice as being right answers to legal questions, punishing people who ought to be punished, fairness in the law, all of which I think plays a role in justice. But I have become convinced that, as I was saying earlier, that what real justice is about is relationship, or what Laura called connection, ultimately. I believe it's about our relationship with God and our relationship with one another. And what I found in my own life is that this understanding of justice has had a feedback on my Christian faith. And so I have ended up thinking a lot more seriously about what Jesus says in places like the Sermon on the Mount, when he's talking about how we should live. And when I think about justice now, that's where I start. I don't start somewhere else in the Bible. I start with the Sermon on the Mount and think about what that means for how we think about justice. So there's been this sort of somersault effect of my perception of justice over time.
So let me just make sure that the audience is hearing everything that I'm hearing.
Are you sure you want the audience to hear everything you're hearing?
So we have two people that have pursued a degree in law. One grew up in a relationship, a very close relationship with God, and has found that life has a different expression than only the way to look through God's eyes. And the other one did not meet God until later in life and has now allowed that relationship to define him. So what this actually brings me to, I'm actually kind of excited. So I have found something that I want to share, because I didn't think I was going to share this but let me start with this question. This is me calling an audible. So you could make the argument that the problem in our society is not that people don't know they should help others. Fair? Most know and believe. The real problem is, while knowing it, they are insufficiently motivated to actually do it. So I'm going to borrow a quote from a former professor at Yale Law School, Arthur Leff. He shares, looking around the world, neither reason, love, nor even terror seems to have worked to make us good. And worse than that, there's no reason why anything should. Leff continues by saying, because we live in a relativistic world, it is impossible to convince people that there is an absolute moral standard to follow. Even when we use love or practical reason, nothing works. How do we make sense of that?
Well, I'm a postmodernist at heart, so I rarely talk about truth because I question its existence. I think we always are looking at an issue, a situation, through the lens of our own viewpoint, which is influenced by many things. I hope I've articulated some of the things that I'm aware of influencing myself, but I think we're also influenced by many things that we're not aware of. So I resist a conception of truth, and therefore I think I would agree with Leff to that extent. But I do think it's important to have a guiding principle that is larger than oneself, right? And this is a key part of what it means to walk humbly with one's God, from Micah 6:8. It's important that we make decisions that are not totally in our own self-interest or motivated by our own selfish desires, but rather are seeking to find something greater in life. And for me, it was once Jesus Christ. I think for a while, then it was a total denial of Jesus Christ. It was binary thinking of the sort that I resist now. And so what is my guiding principle? An acute awareness of power dynamics, not just between individuals, but on a systemic or structural level, constantly asking who wins and who loses based on the way society is currently structured, and asking if that is the right balance. There are always going to be winners and losers, but I think we always have to constantly question, are our systems benefiting the right people, or are they unduly harming the wrong people, and how can we act more justly on a structural and systemic way?
So let me ask you the harder question, Laura. If, let's just say that there is a portion of society that follows that. I believe there's a good portion of society. Do you think that it's working to become more just as a society?
Yeah. I mean, you just have to watch the Kardashians, I think, to see that we're becoming, in some ways, increasingly self-centered and narcissistic. Maybe there is a higher power, but it's consumption as a higher power, which I think does not enable us to act justly, love mercy, or walk humbly. So no, it's not working. I think the university is the one place where we maybe can begin to plant the seeds that help people find their own paths, their own guiding principles that are something other than oneself or consumption. But, I'm not even sure universities are doing as good of a job as they could in planting those seeds.
So, David, let me ask you the Christian counterpart. Why aren't Christians doing justice in the way we would see the Bible describing it?
It's a great question. In some cases, I think they are, and they have, but I agree with the assumption under your question, which is very frequently Christians are not contributing to justice, or they are contributing to injustice or interfering with justice. And it seems to me that the principal answer to the question, why is that, is the Bible makes very clear that each of us is fallen, that we live in a world that is broken, and that each one of us is broken and is imperfect and is sinful, and that's reflected in the lives of Christians as well. And so I think that would be the short answer. The hope in Christianity is that Jesus provides, in my view, a model for the way forward, a model for how to live that isn't focused solely on ourselves, that reverses the normal order of the world, that where serving is the highest form of leadership, where the lowly will be exalted and the exalted made low. And so in terms of the overall long-term effect, there's reason for optimism. But I do think Christians have many of the same failings as everyone else. In my view, that is not a failing of Christianity. It's a failing of Christians. And that the beauty of Christianity is that it's self-correcting in that regard, that focusing on what Jesus called for and what he is a solution to those problems. And you can look back to some of the principal moments of justice that we use as touchstones in our culture, the most obvious being the civil rights movement, and it has that feel to it. And one of the things that has always struck me about the civil rights movement was it was not principally a law movement. I think law played an important role in the movement, but it really was a movement about transforming people's hearts and being serious about the kinds of things Jesus calls us to.
So let me throw myself under the bus. I think this is a fair way of doing it. So I, as a believer in Christ, struggle with areas that the very thing that I don't want, or the things that I hate, I find myself doing. Right? And so, if we're really talking about justice, right, where does that motivation come from? Whether it's with or without God. I think we've just both described the scenario that, all right, we're following different frameworks on stage, but where does the motivation come from to do the very thing that neither of us are doing?
We're wondering which one of us you're going to look at first.
You can start.
Oh, thanks. I'll jump in.
That's nice, Laura.
So,
hot seat, brother. Hot seat.
Yeah, we're scared of David, as you can tell. I'm scared. I don't know if Laura is. So that's one of the places on that issue. I completely share your experience of what I think and what I believe and what I believe we're called to is often at war with what I actually do and the way my life actually looks. And that's one of those places where Christianity, I think, has a very compelling story to tell about justice. And what Christianity shows us, in my view, over and over, is we are incapable of justice on our own. Christianity is the only major religion or system of thought whose hero was murdered by the law. Jesus was falsely accused. He was arrested on false pretenses. He had a sham trial. And he was put to death, not under lousy legal systems, but under the two of the finest legal systems the ancient world had ever known, the Jewish legal system and the Roman legal system. And so Christianity gives us a diagnosis. It says we are incapable of achieving justice, true justice, on our own. But Christianity also teaches that God will provide justice and that God will reform the corruption of the world, and that the ultimate future of the world is a world that has been put to rights, where justice characterizes our interactions with one another. So I think Christianity gives you this kind of complicated perspective on justice. One, it shows us why it is that we so repeatedly fail to achieve justice, but it also shows us the big picture, the long-term story, and tells us we can be part of that story. And that if we are part of that story, the small contributions we make to justice, as imperfect as they may be, may have eternal significance. They may be part of God's eternal reclamation project. So in my view, Christianity is short-term pessimistic about justice, but long-term optimism. And that is something that I can embrace and want to embrace and makes me feel called to contribute to justice.
Laura.
You know, your answer gives me some insight into why I might focus less on justice than I focus on mercy and humility as I go about my daily life. I think, though, I might disagree with you to the extent that Christianity, while highlighting the inability to actually achieve justice in this lifetime, might give us some guidance of how, by relying on God and Jesus Christ, we could find justice in the afterlife or on a higher plane. Because I fear at times that Christianity in particular can be exclusionary. Feeding into an us versus them paradigm. I realized this early on in my life. I grew up in northern Indiana. For kindergarten and first grade, part of second grade, I went to school in South Bend, Indiana, which is where Notre Dame is located. I went to public school. In first grade, one afternoon a week, every student except two of us left for CCD, the Catholic Educational, and the two people who did not go were me, Laura Rosenbury, and Danny Rosenberg. And so we were accused of killing Jesus. because we weren't going to CCD. Now, I think, where do first graders develop that rhetoric? It's from, in some ways, the fact that it's hard to be nuanced when you're in first grade. But I now see it as a danger of Christianity that at bottom, at its core, it could be exclusionary. It could be an us versus them. I will say my mom and Danny Rosenberg's mom came to the class and explained that there were other religions other than Christianity. My mom talked about the Anabaptist faith, the Church of the Brethren. Danny's mom obviously talked about Judaism. But instead of that illustrating to me the potential for pluralism, even within a Christian-based belief system, my mom said, "Don't worry, you won't have to deal with Catholics much longer. We're moving to the country," right? And so that's where I begin to struggle. I agree with you so much, David, but I get quite concerned, particularly in today's political discourse. And I went to law school with Ted Cruz, so I'm thinking a lot about the political campaign. And
now, you're not suggesting he's divisive, are you?
And he believes deeply, and I actually think he's more nuanced in person than he is on the campaign trail. But I see the danger there, at least on a national scale.
I think those are very fair points, and I have a lot of sympathy, particularly with your experience, which is an experience that I've heard over and over, primarily from Jewish friends and colleagues, about what they experienced in schools, in particular when they were growing up. And I think that was a mistake. I think that teaching religion in public schools is really a misunderstanding of what Christianity teaches us about culture and politics as well. Christianity is exclusionary, and I don't want to dodge that at all, in the sense that Christians believe that the way we can be reconciled with God is through Jesus, and that alternative perspectives are not an accurate description of how we can be reconciled with God. But the one small place that I'd want to push back, and I may not even be pushing back, given your postmodern tendencies, and I have some sympathies with many of those tendencies. I don't believe there's a neutral point that we can stand on. So Christianity is exclusionary, but if you there is no perspective that is fully pluralistic. So a view that says we can't have any religion or any particular perspective represented here is a view that's taking a stand on religions and other perspectives. It's saying that none of them is accurate. None of them is pointing us towards truth. So in my view, every worldview, every view of who we are and how the universe works is ultimately exclusionary. We have different views. And so I think if one agrees with that, the question is, does one set of beliefs, first of all, is it more compelling? And second of all, does it work better? Is it less likely to produce those kinds of experiences? And my view is that Christianity works really well when it's followed. And unfortunately, it hasn't always been followed effectively. But I think the main thing is, I don't believe that there's a neutral place to stand on. Each of us has a view. We either hold to a system of thought, or we hold to a religion, or we hold to a view, a completely postmodern view that there is no true system of thought or religion, and that is itself an exclusionary standing point.
I've heard it said, and I don't pretend to understand all of the wisdom behind it, but I've heard it said that the Christian life is not meant to be lived. And I think the inference is we are not capable of living the Christian life. No human is. I think what that suggests is to live it requires impartation or a transformation of God Himself to be in you to live out His existence. But again, I don't pretend to understand that fully, because I think we're all trying to understand our own worldview relative to. So, keeping in that vein, who should make our society just? Laura?
All of us. I mean, we all have a role to play. And I think maybe part of the reason our political dialogue and other social dialogue has become so anemic is because we aren't taking that obligation seriously. Which means that the people who are at the binaries and you know, some would say the zealots can control a lot of the discourse, and there's not a lot of room for even civil disagreement between those two poles, and also not a lot of exploration of what exists between the poles. I absolutely agree with David that there's never a neutral. We're always drawing lines. Some people will always win, and some people will always lose. But we have to be aware of the ways we're drawing those lines, even when it's invisible, even when it seems neutral. There are always hidden baselines. So, you know, I think what I experienced in first grade in South Bend, Indiana, obviously highlighted in that community a Catholic baseline. You know, obviously, there's also a lot of anti-Catholic bias. But in that community, the norm, the neutral, allegedly, was Catholic. Likewise, throughout most of the country still today, I would say, for instance, if you think of the ideal worker, if you just think of who is an ideal worker in your mind, you're thinking of a white man. So the men are the hidden baseline of who is the norm, and likewise, white privilege pervades almost our entire society. So we all have an obligation to first be aware of those hidden baselines, to be aware of those issues of power and privilege, and then begin multiple dialogues about, is this the way we want our society to be?
So I'm gonna stick with you, Laura, for a follow-up with that thought, because I think that's an interesting one. How should our worldview correlate to shaping the law?
Well, there can never be a neutral. So our worldview is already implicated. Part of what I try to do in my teaching is to expose that. To say, you know, a judge can never be totally neutral. A judge can never be totally objective. Likewise, I can't be totally neutral or objective. We're always going to bring our own perspectives. And so the key is, how do we train ourselves to be aware of how our own experiences, perceptions, some might say biases, affect our approach to decision making, but also to our conceptions of what the good life is. And how are we, sometimes maybe unwittingly, perpetuating injustice by refusing to recognize, say, white privilege or male privilege?
David, how would you tackle that one? What is the relationship of law and worldview? I mean, how do we? Because ultimately, right, when we think of justice, it's an action. Justice isn't just a philosophy. It in itself, it requires us to do. That's the word. Justice is actually the doing of something. It's the action. So when you think about your worldview, or you can start in either direction, ultimately, how does the law change to represent everybody's worldview? Is that possible?
I'm not sure if it's possible to answer that question, but this is another really big question, and I was glad you asked Laura the question you just asked, which was a version of this, and I really liked Laura's answer. I mean, I really think the starting point of justice and rethinking justice and influencing justice is recognizing that each one of us has a responsibility, and that it starts with each of us. And I do like the idea of trying to be aware of what our perspective is and sometimes what our biases is. Another really important objective, in my view, in a culture as heterogeneous as our culture is being serious about pluralism. And it's very, very difficult to be serious about pluralism, be serious about giving different perspectives, a Catholic perspective, an Anabaptist perspective, a Jewish perspective, a non-religious perspective, equal space, or space to thrive and to live out their vision of the good life. It's really hard to achieve that when you happen to have a majority. So until the last generation, Protestants in this country, people like me, had a silent majority. And we were in a position to dictate what our social institutions looked like. The ideal justice, in my view, would be a justice where even if there were one group that had the ability to control what our law looks like, what our social institutions look like, they wouldn't. And they would be sufficiently committed to pluralism to let other perspectives flourish. And in my view, again, that's something that comes straight out of the Bible. I mean, Christians have not done that historically when Christians have been in power any more than other groups have done it when they've been in power. But I think that's what the Bible calls us to. I think it calls us to participate individually in justice, as flawed as we are, to be committed to pluralism and to trying to persuade people of other perspectives, of the rightness of our perspective, but persuading them, not coercing them.
So one of the most popular questions that we received from the hundreds and hundreds of students that provided feedback in the form of questions, I wanted to highlight because I think it really taps into what we're discussing. So in the question of, is our society just, the question that got flagged was, our society is mostly just, but not all groups are protected to the same extent due to certain factors such as socioeconomic status or race. What do we do with that, Laura?
Well, I do think economic inequality is the next big social justice issue that we're going to have to tackle. The growing gulf between the haves and the have-nots in our economic system is staggering, and it's hard to even confront because it seems so vast and seems so beyond our control. I must say that, I am a family law scholar. I write a lot about families, and as a result of that, obviously, everyone wanted me to think about same-sex marriage, right? And I actually, if you know my, politics, if you can figure them out up to now, of course I'm in favor of same-sex marriage, in part for pluralistic reasons. But I'm also really concerned about how marriage has been the guiding or becoming the dominant way of structuring intimacy in our society. I think at one point, when marriage was not available to individuals who identified as queer. We had examples of alternative forms of kinship and intimacy that were really important. But now the normative force of marriage is even more intense. Now anyone can get married so long as you're two, right? And why am I so concerned about that? Well, part of it has to do with freedom and how our imaginations might be limited by this marriage monopoly. But also because I think in our economic system, marriage exists to privatize dependency. Our economic system, our conception of the state, does not believe in supporting the dependencies of children and others. Instead, we have the system of marriage to operate as an incentive for people to take care of dependency on their own without state assistance. And marriage is doing a great job at that, except increasingly those at the lower end of the economic ladder, those who do not have a college degree, who just have some college or no college, are not getting married. Because for them, there's nothing to economically benefit from by getting married. And so we're the haves and have-nots are getting further and further apart, and marriage is a tool that instead of bringing choice and liberation to people, is actually cementing in place economic inequality. So for me, this is something, my conception of justice is talking about marriage's role in the privatization of dependency, which very few people talk about. People think of marriage as an individual choice, not something that perpetuates our current economic system.
Thank you, Laura.
You ask a big question, you get a big answer.
What are your thoughts, David?
So my thoughts are, I'm more sympathetic to marriage than Laura is, not surprisingly, although I'm also very sympathetic to a number of points that Laura has made both here and in her scholarship, which is phenomenal. I do think that marriage is a unique relationship. It's a distinctive context for children and for intimacy, and I am comfortable with supporting it. I think for parts of society that now where marriage is very, very much on the decline, as Laura was talking about, below the middle class, marriage is becoming more and more rare. My hope would be that marriage would once again become more common. I think that marriage would help to address many of the problems in that we see in those contexts. But I also think that we have tended to unfortunately de-emphasize other forms of intimacy, and I want to define intimacy broadly to mean things like friendship and relationships of that sort. And I agree completely with Laura that we do have a tendency to, or we have had a tendency to not take those relationships seriously and not to nurture them to the extent we could. So I do think that marriage is the optimal context for children to be raised, and I think so far the empirical evidence very strongly supports that. I mean, it's empirical evidence that's coming out of a particular culture with a particular set of norms, but it suggests that outcomes of children on almost any yardstick that you use are better if they're raised in the context of two parents. But I do agree that other forms of intimacy are, in some respects, not respected quite as much as they ought to be, and other alternatives are not respected quite as much. And I think on many of these issues, I think if we went issue by issue, I suspect Laura and I would agree on the legal implication. The one thing I want to throw in here is what the optimal approach to child rearing, family, relationship is what you believe the optimal approach is not the same thing as what the optimal law is necessarily, depending on where the culture is at a particular point in time. I don't think that our laws, on our family laws in particular, currently reflect a Christian perspective on these issues, and in many respects, I think that's okay, given where we are. So I've kind of rambled on, but I guess what the bottom line would be, I'm more sympathetic to marriage than Laura is, and to the idea that it's something that should be reinforced rather than reduced in its influence. But I also think we have sacrificed other forms of intimacy, I think, that play a very, very important role in people's lives.
So we've reached the time where we're going to transition into questions from the audience, and I've noticed that we have 2 questions in front of us. How can we as students / leaders affect the current track of human justice? What say you, Laura?
That's a hard question, but I think the campus activism that we've seen recently shows both promise and peril. I think the engagement of students on campus to really grapple with hard questions like economic inequality or white privilege has been really energizing for people, has changed the discourse in many ways, and that's important. And so, yes, it can devolve into a binary, almost dictatorial approach, like you either do this or we shut it down, which I find maybe is useful sometimes, but is not as an overall strategy going to help us achieve justice. It will bring attention to an issue, but it's not going to help us achieve justice. But taking the time and energy to identify injustices and bring them to people's attention and to put it on the agenda, to maybe even force it on the agenda, is something that student leaders have been doing very effectively, and I hope you'll continue to do it.
David?
I agree. I mean, I will say, I'll add my own caution to it. I completely agree that taking dramatic steps is sometimes necessary. In biblical terms, we would talk about it in terms of prophecy and the prophetic, and I think there is an important role for that. My concern on campuses in particular is about the danger of what I would call silencing, that sometimes the form that a protest takes is silencing any conversation and ruling alternative perspectives out of bounds. And so in my view, the ideal place or the ideal form of ferment to have on a campus like this one that is very influential nationally and internationally, and where a lot of these ideas are getting worked out, is a ferment that involves identifying perceived injustices, making sure that they aren't just ignored on the one hand, but also seeking conversation and debate about these issues rather than silencing other perspectives. And that's an almost impossible quest to carry out, but I think that's what we should be aspiring to.
So we've received the second question from the audience. David, I'm going to stick with you. Should the Bible be used as a standard of justice for governments around the world?
So it strikes me that the answer to that question, we get to see it up here, so I had a second to think about it. It really depends on what you mean by using the standard of Bible, using the Bible as the standard of justice. If what that means is mapping your civil laws onto what the Bible says about particular issues, I think probably not, what it says explicitly or what it calls Christians to. But if what we're saying is a biblical conception of what justice looks like, I think the answer is yes. I think a Christian biblical conception of what justice looks like is a conception that doesn't dictate a particular point of view, that leaves room for pluralism, that doesn't entrench the powerful, that is mindful that Jesus said the high will be made low and the low will be exalted, and operates on those kinds of principles. So if what one has in mind is biblical principles for justice, I think they would be great principles for justice in any country, in any time. If what it means is taking the Hebrew Bible, looking at the commands of the Hebrew Bible, and translating them into a civil justice system, I think no. I think that would not be an appropriate form of justice.
So let's use the latter for a second, just for the sake of digging a little deeper. Let's use the migration of the hundreds and thousands of people in the Middle East that are being pushed into other areas of the world, persecuted. How would you use the concept of the Bible that has enough latitude to manage that circumstance? Because that's a tough circumstance.
It is a very tough circumstance, and I don't think the standard answer on a law school exam question, the way we were taught to answer all of our questions was, this is a very difficult question that does not admit of an easy answer. And so that's the way I would start my answer to that question. But what I would say is, it's complicated, but I think there's some basic principles. One is the Bible teaches us centrally that we're to love our neighbor as we are to love ourselves. And so we, even as Americans, most of whom have never been to the Middle East, I feel we have a real obligation to the people who are suffering as a result of what's going on in the Middle East. So that's the starting point. The complication, I think, is I don't think that we are called to uncritically say, everybody come here. I think that there is a role for a nation, just as there's a role for a family, and that it is appropriate for the nation to think about the interests of its citizens first, not as opposed to the interest of those outside the nation, but how those two things fit together. And so I don't think the answer from a Christian perspective would be we just instantly allow every migrant to come to our shores. But I do think we are called to love our neighbor as ourselves, and it suggests we should be bending in that direction.
So in the interest of time, I'm going to move on to another question. The third question: if we define justice for ourselves, how can there be true justice?
There can't be true justice, in my view. I know, though, that is a particular view. Many people would label it a postmodern view. Some would say it's relativistic. I don't think we will ever have a true justice, and I don't think we can embrace the principles of humility if we claim that there is some true justice. I keep going back to this Bible verse, but it informs all of my thinking on almost every issue. With the last prong, to walk humbly with your God, is not even talking about one God, right? It's not with God. It's your God. Emphasizing that we will all have our own conceptions of God. And likewise, we will have our own conceptions of justice. Now, hopefully, we can have enough compatibility in our conceptions that we might be able to band together to promote a pluralistic society, and also one that I would hope would join pluralism with inclusion. But there can never be, in my mind, true justice.
So I'm gonna pry a little bit. So if you think about a situation where you have individuals that their interpretation of God, whether it's themselves or a deity, that the doctrines of their belief system suggest world domination, or something that would not be to promote or foster a just society. How do we reconcile that? Because we know that society reflects that. So I'm trying to bring up a relevant truth.
Yeah, I don't know if we can reconcile it. I mean, we can deeply disagree, hopefully respectfully, in the spirit of pluralism. But, I also think we would also have an obligation to challenge in a respectful way if it's so at odds with one's own worldview. So I'm not sure exactly what you're getting at with
Me neither.
that. Okay. David, do you want to?
Oh, thanks a lot, Laura. I was just basking over here in the fact that it's your problem, not my problem.
No, what I was trying to say was, if we can't go after, if we can't target what awesome looks like, right? If we don't have the collective faith that there's enough people that share a belief system that gets us as a society to a safe place to allow us all to coexist and still have our personal worldview or version of the truth, where is our hope?
Well, the first step is learning, if possible, to be comfortable without knowing the answer, with realizing there's, in my view, no one there with the answers that I just have to find. I think for me in my religious journey, given that my life was so structured around the church for the first 17 years of my life, I always assumed there was someone, a higher power, with the answers, who would save me, who would tell me what to do. And then leaving that worldview initially made me think, okay, the university will be the substitute, that my professors, that if I study hard enough, I will find the answer. And it wasn't until law school, and really it wasn't until my third year of law school, interestingly, taking a class on family law with Martha Minow, who's now the dean of Harvard Law School, that I realized actually the key is realizing that no one else has the answer. That in fact, part of what the university and all of this education had prepared me to do was to become comfortable with not knowing, but still interrogating and still striving with others to think about how to live in a society that was more, some would say just, others would say inclusive and equal.
So David, it seemed as if you have, you grew up with not knowing, and you found something, and I know you referred to a book that was one of the catalysts of clarity for you that allowed you to say, there is something that I was able to find because I want to make sure that I'm understanding Laura's view. Is I'm not convinced that anybody has found the truth, yet you feel that you have.
I think that violates the humility principle that Laura started out on, which I completely agree with us. But let me
Yes.
interact with that, because I think it's a great question. So I do differ from Laura in that I believe there is a moral structure to the universe, and I believe that God is responsible for that moral structure of the universe. I believe that each of us is made in the image of God. So I believe that in some way, a longing for justice and a sense of justice is wired into us. And so I believe that no matter how different we are, how different our perspectives are, what religion we adhere to, what system of thought we adhere to, we do have some sense of what justice looks like. So I'm optimistic in the possibility of a vision of justice. I believe that there are many obstacles to achieving that justice, and many of them are the kinds of obstacles that Laura has identified. I think that our own self-interest is an obstacle to justice. To the extent we have power, we tend to want to use it to favor ourselves. Our inability to see that we're coming from a particular perspective, that we don't have a monopoly on truth or access to truth. I think that interferes with our ability to achieve justice. But I do believe there is a moral structure to the universe, and that because we are, as I believe, made in the image of God, that we have a similar moral structure, and so that you can appeal ultimately to a similar awesome sense of justice, to use the word that you use. We don't often have that joint project that we're working on together, but I think it is possible.
So let me ask this, because this combines a few of the questions that were asked previously from students. If something were to happen to, let's just say, 8-year-old girl that had to do with human slavery, would it be, let me ask it differently, I don't want to suggest an answer. If anybody around the world saw that, do you think that they all would have the same takeaway of it being injustice?
Well, historically, the answer would be no. I mean, historically, child labor was very common, and many children were seen as indentured servants, or I think what we would consider slaves. Now, obviously, we like to think we've evolved. I think we cling to a progress narrative, and in many respects that narrative is correct, but I don't think it's universal. So I don't think everyone would agree that that is a wrong. Now, I certainly would, and I would, as part of my quest for justice, try to help people see that reality from the child's eyes, to see how that child's potential is being limited, how the child's future is being limited, but also how their life in the here and now is being made miserable and painful because of someone else's desires to use the child for economic gain or some other purpose. So I would strive to, in this way, impose my conception of justice, but I certainly wouldn't assume that everyone believed as I did. Would your perception of that change if the crime was more heinous? For instance, if it was rape, if an 8-year-old girl was raped,
would everyone around the world have a sense of that's wrong no matter what I believe in?
I think, once again, historically, the answer is no. And child marriage is still common in some parts of the world. And so I think, now, should people universally think it's wrong is another question. But do they universally believe it's wrong? The answer is no.
Why should they?
Well, this is where I've thought a lot about children in my work, and how particularly the law tends to view children no longer as the property of their parents, but still very much as beings at the bottom of a hierarchy, and who won't lead a good life until they become adults. So, children are not viewed as beings in and of themselves. Rather, we regulate their lives by acknowledging that they're not yet adults. And in doing so, we construct them almost entirely as pre-adults, as opposed to acknowledging that children have worth in the here and now. Children have intrinsic interest and intrinsic value. So I would use that belief to argue that, of course, one should not rape an 8-year-old child. That would just be one approach. I think there would be many other approaches, including those rooted much more tightly in Christianity, that would come to a similar conclusion.
Absolutely. David, since we're actually running out of time, we have one final question. In terms of justice, what defines a great leader?
It's a great and very big question, and I would want to return to the idea of relationship as the key focus for a great leader in terms of justice. A great leader, in my view, is a leader that seeks to promote relationship within our society across social status, strata, across other potential barriers, and focuses in his or her actions on restoring relationship where relationship has been broken. And it seems to me that the moments that we look back on as great moments in American history, and again, the obvious example is the Civil Rights Movement, are often moments where a great leader or leaders promoted relationship where relationship did not exist before.
Laura, in terms of justice, what defines a great leader?
I agree almost completely with David. I would also add, though, if we are going to use examples such as the Civil Rights Movement, the courage to speak truth to power is also necessary. It's not just building relationships with one another in the existing paradigm, but also having the courage to question the existing paradigm. To speak, truth to power. I don't believe in truth, but this is a good phrase. to call into question the existing system and seek a new one. Those are the leaders who help us develop more nuanced conceptions of justice, but also help us advance conceptions of justice, however we define them. We've covered a lot tonight. What should be the takeaway? What should the audience leave with? What's the most important thing that you'd want them to hear? That we should all be thinking more about how we can make this a better society, and how we can, on a daily basis, assist those in need. Assist those who are currently losing under our existing system. And I will say that as I become more and more enmeshed in the academy, particularly as a dean, as a leader of an academic unit, I feel more and more removed from that aspect of justice, the daily assistance to those in need. Now, I can do other work, planting seeds like I discussed before, or helping others do the daily work, but I actually am coming away from this with the realization that I need to have more daily acts of justice in my life. It can't just be theoretical.
David, take away.
So I pretty much completely agree. So I'll say what I think is largely the same thing with slightly different nuances in a slightly different way. So my takeaway would be to ask each one of you to ask yourselves, do you long for justice? Why is it that you long for justice? As a Christian, I believe it's because of how God made us. God made us in His image, and He has promised us that justice will one day characterize the world, but other people have different perspectives. So do you long for justice? Why do you long for justice? If you do, as most of us do. And finally, what can you do, what can each of us do to promote justice in some small way? How can we make the world a little bit better than it is today?
Thank you for joining our conversation tonight. Please join me in congratulating our presenters.
And thank you. Thank you for excellent questions.
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at veritas.org.